Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini as co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Well, very good. We're going to be talking about Venezuela, and we're wondering whether or not we should copy Venezuela. I mean, are we copying Venezuela? That's the big thing. Some people think we are, and socialism has certainly destroyed that country. And yet today, what we're seeing in America are our politicians saying, yeah, we think socialism is pretty good. And it's a little bit disturbing that some of them are getting elected, at least we're winning these primaries, and they're talking. But we're talking about a different type of socialism. We want democratic socialism. We want dictatorship of the majority, but have socialism and redistributed wealth, even though we ourselves who advocate this are very wealthy ourselves, but this is what we think is best. So that seems to be the big issue now, but there's no doubt in anybody's mind there's really a tragic mess in Venezuela. And that one, it indeed has been socialistic. The governments there in the last decade have just totally destroyed that country, and Maduro is doing the same thing. And they have runaway inflation, which tells us that runaway socialism is related to runaway inflation and spending and debt, and we're doing a pretty good job on that. So that has to be considered. So how do you assess this, Chris, whether what we're seeing in Venezuela? They are in a bad shape, but they followed policies that we are very much engaged in, but I would argue that we're not quite socialistic yet.
No, I totally agree with you. However, the parts of socialism that we do have are hurting our country tremendously. And we're not exempt from anything. We're not exempt from the sun shining on all of us, from the rain falling on all of us. All economic laws apply to Venezuelans and to Americans. There are no exemptions. So supply and demand applies to them, and it applies to us. And the laws of marginal utility and diminishing returns, same, it all applies. The difference is that America has a global currency, so it buys us time from the same exact fate. Venezuela does not have the luxury of having a global currency, so they suffer the fate very quickly and much sooner than us. But if we continue down this road, the same exact consequences are waiting for us.
You know, there isn't a precise definition of socialism for all forms of socialism, because it is true they refer to socialism in Scandinavia, which really isn't quite the case. And they talk about socialist policies here in this country, but you have National Socialism, which is a substitute for state socialism. That was, you know, the Nazi type of form and the fascist type of form. They allow companies and corporations still to be owned, but once they take over and start total control and pricing, then you do have socialism no matter whose name the property is in. Sometimes I worry about that in this country because we claim, oh, well, we own our property, so we can do what we want. We can hardly do anything with what we want with our property without, you know, permission from the government. So they have these controls. And then you have the other form of extremism in socialism, and that is the communist. But the more significant it gets, the more dictatorial it becomes. So if you want socialism in a place like North Korea, then you have to have a dictator running things. And that is, of course, a big problem. But where's the tipping point with going from a very, very interventionist economy where there's over-regulations and you have inflation in the central bank and you have welfarism and warfarism? What's the tipping point over into socialism? I think the most important tipping point is when the government takes over the pricing structure. And Mises pointed this so clearly, and his explanation why socialism always fails is you need prices. You need the market to tell us what the price is, what the people want, know what to do and what to produce. And once you lose that, you don't know what to produce. And socialism happened, that's what happened. In Venezuela, they destroyed the pricing system and they gave all these controls, but there was no restraint on welfarism. And here, it's the wealthiest country in South America when you look at when you look at what they own with their oil supplies, yet it hasn't worked because they accepted these notions of socialism. It is a little bit discouraging, and it is a challenge to us right now about the people who are accepting that socialism may be an answer to our problems, because they falsely say that we've had too much freedom, too much free markets and capitalism, and therefore we have to do something else. So they argue we need socialism. I believe there's a lot of fallacy in that description of what we should do.
Yes, and that was a great analysis of destroying the pricing system, because that's what socialists do even today. The democratic socialists, they exploit people's vulnerabilities for wanting something for free. So they go out with this free, hey, wouldn't you like this for free? Wouldn't you like this for free? But it's a big scam. I mean, let's take a bag of Doritos in the supermarket. It's thanks to the Fed's inflation, it's now $4.50 to get a bag of chips. And what would happen if the supermarket brings it down to $1? By the time you get to the supermarket, the shelf is empty. People, they gobble it up, and that's at $1. Now, what happens when it's free? It's one person could grab the whole shelf. And this is what happens when they try to peddle free medical care. You know, if you have free medical care, anybody could go, if they have a splinter, go ahead, it's free, go to the doctors. And when that happens, now government piles on, and then they get in and they tell you, well, this is who can go get the operation. This is who cannot. And now you have to know a politician to go get an operation and offer him something in return so that he can take care of you. It's a total mess. And once you destroy pricing, that's when everything goes downhill. Right.
And then the motivation is easy to play on, because people believe that rights are said to be when you need something, you have a right to it, and then they demand it, and they have to deliver to one. And this is something that has been going on. There's a lot of greed out there, and they don't think you have to work for it because they have a moral right to it, is what they argue. How could you mean it? People don't have a right to a place to live, a right to food, and a right to medical care. Otherwise, it would be that you're a monster. Unless you study economics and unless you study history and find out, well, if you do care, if you have humanitarian instincts, you have to accept freedom and the marketplace, because it has delivered goods and services to the most number of people ever. The largest middle class comes from a system that is even relatively free. We didn't have a perfectly free society in our early history, but it was pretty darn good, and the middle class thrived. So this is a intellectual problem, because people blame the wrong things. The demagogues are there. The university professors teach this, and it goes along with the politicians who demagogue it and say that there is such a thing as a free lunch. There was a saying that was around for a long time. It was Tanstaffel, and that is, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Well, they don't believe that a minute. They believe there is such a thing as a free lunch, because they see what's happening in corporatism for the corporations and the bailouts and all the profiteering in the military-industrial complex. It looks like a free lunch for them. You know, they're getting benefits from the government. So I think it's so important to sort all this out, that there isn't anything for free, but people have to be rewarded for their effort and their energy and their work and their output and their productivity. And then I think the people will be maximally taken care of in that manner, whether it's medical care or whatever. I grew up in the early part of my medical career. We didn't have government medicine. And I don't recall big problems, it didn't exist. It wasn't the problems that drove us to accept so much more government medicine. It was the desire of the lobbyists coming in, the insurance companies and the drug companies and the management companies, financing companies. They're all the ones that wanted to move us toward more government. So I think that people have to decide whether or not they think that just being dependent and demanding their right to somebody else's stuff that will solve the problems. If they're awake, if they're paying any attention, they have to look and say, maybe that's what the problem was in Venezuela. They had all the wealth, And yet the people got poorer and poorer, and the tyrants got more powerful than ever, and that's where they are today, and they don't have an answer. But I think we should be able to suggest a few of those answers.
Yes, and I'm sure most people that saw our title today, are we heading towards Venezuela, are thinking to themselves, absolutely not, no way. And I tend to agree with them. I think there's still a lot of sense left in America. I think there's a lot of people that just keep quiet and go about their business, but they know right from wrong, I guess. However, when you look at what our government is doing, they are not stopping with debt. The debt does not stop. The wars do not stop. The welfare is not stopping, and neither is the inflation. So they are full force going in the wrong direction. And the Americans that are quiet are going to have to speak up sooner or later in order to reverse this. Otherwise, like I said earlier, we are heading in Venezuela's direction.
Yes, and we can't predict exactly what will happen because that depends on the human actions, the actions of individuals, countries, and the politicians and all. So I don't think that we will go into a state, like you suggest, where we just go to have runaway inflation here in this country, and we're bartering right now in Venezuela. They have bartering, but they're trading in markets. They're totally inefficient. The haircuts, you have to have eggs and other things to go in. Eggs and banana for a haircut, and that's how silly the whole thing gets. But I think in one way we won't get that way, but I remember the 70s very well, and a lot of concern because we went off the gold standard, and that's when we had an explosion of inflation, and we had an inflation rate of 15% and interest rates of 21%, and it was devastating, and people were very frightened. I think we'll move into something like that, but maybe even twice that, but that still isn't Venezuela. But it will prompt, in my estimation, some changes. There will have to be some reforms done in order to stop it. Mainly because I think it'll be, in one way, it won't be as bad domestically, but overall it might be much worse because our dollar is a worldwide reserve currency and people will have to adjust. I can't quite visualize how that can be done smoothly. I think there's a little bit of movement in that direction already because some countries are accumulating gold and they're talking a lot about an alternative currency and a competing reserve currency. If it could move slowly and steadily and from one to another, which it has in the past, that couldn't be the worst thing in the world. But there will be one thing for sure. I think the standard of living will go down for a lot of people. The dollar is linked to so many countries, and I think it'll go down for most Americans in many ways, and there will be a lot of liquidation of debt, and they'll have to face up to it. But let's hope we don't have the total destruction of what is happening, in Venezuela right now. But there's a suggestion going on right now. There's a couple countries getting together that they think that they can be helpful. And I want to just read this. I want to read this title of this article. It says, Colombia, United States, Mexico, and Panama seek to combat Venezuelan corruption. Wow, that is very good. But can you imagine where the corruption is? In banking, it's in money, it's counterfeit money, it's debt, it's socialized medicine. And all these countries believe in this. So we're going to go down and correct this corruption. And so they think of corruption as somebody who stuck a couple $1 million in their pocket, not the corruption of the system, the philosophy that's behind this, central banking. I mean, the corruption in the world today is the corruption of the dollar. Just think of how many people suffered just recently in the 2009 recession and still suffering from that. That was a wiping out of a large amount of middle class, and one of the reasons people are still upset because they haven't recovered, but they have answered the question by more corruption, print more money and give it to the banks and bail out the people who can buy back their own stocks and make that small number of people wealthier than ever. And this group of people, and we're going to go down and make sure we get rid of the corruption. They see corruption as a very narrow sense. We see corruption as a corruption of ideas. And if it's ideological, you have to refute the ideology. There's a lot of corruption in almost all governments, even the governments that we have, or especially, when it comes to welfare and warfare and military-industrial complex. But they see it somewhat differently. But it's the corruption of ideas, the corruption of the idea that private property is somewhat bad, that people can't sort out their problem, that you need dictators, you need, a dictator to sort this out and to redistribute the wealth, whether it's done in a system that is slightly worse than, the authoritarian fascists and communists, but anyway, it's the principle of authoritarianism versus voluntarism and property rights, and that's where the corruption is. It's ideological corruption that is even worse than the corruption of a crooked politician. And when you look at our judicial system, we're going down to straighten out corruption in Venezuela. All you have to do is look around. Don't turn on the TV. It will be very depressing when you find out, our Department of Justice and our FBI and CIA, that you mean they're violating their oaths and they're the ones who are supposed to clean up the corruption. So the process is very corrupt. So I think it's the philosophy of government that we have accepted, that the world has accepted, that has to be challenged, it has to be changed. And when the financial crisis hit, that's what I think our job has to be, is to be able to refute them and say why socialism is bad. And quite frankly, I mentioned the concern we should have about some of our candidates declaring they're socialists and winning. I don't think that is a sign of what the mental status is of everybody in this country now. I don't think that is there, because I still run into a lot of young people that know and understand what libertarianism is about, what freedom is all about, what Austrian economics is all about. So I have a little more hope by that. But I think those are warning signs of what's happening. But the biggest warning signs, Chris, is what you've already mentioned. Debt and inflation, the printing of money, it's around there, and it can lead to the chaos that might, demand that we have a new system. The big question is, are we going to move in the direction of Venezuela, or are we going to move in the direction of a free society?
Well, that's all going to depend on the ideas that are in the hearts and the minds of the American people. Forget about the government. They're what they are. But whatever the Americans believe over the long term will prevail. And I'll finish, Dr. Paul. The ideas of liberty, they flourished in Britain and especially in America. This was the land of the free. And the socialists, about 150 years ago, they knew that you're not going to have Bolsheviks in America, so they were going to quietly and slowly, like a drip, just chip away at the liberty in America. And they have largely succeeded with the institution of the Federal Reserve, with the military empire, with wars and welfare. These are all socialism, all of it. And it's gobbled up American liberty. And Britain is further down the road than we are here, thankfully. They're, a lot of times, I think they're the guinea pigs with the surveillance state and everything, and the police state, and then it's exported over here. But ultimately, liberty can win. If the people believe in it, understand it, it's not hard to understand. And this 150 years of socialism boiling the frog can be reversed, and we can live.
Very good. And also, I want to touch on something that's a little bit more difficult to handle, because it has been said by many that an immoral society, people that's immoral, cannot really live with freedom, because it becomes so abusive. So it depends a lot on the moral standards of the people, or at least the prevailing attitudes. You're not supposed to lie, cheat, and steal and hurt people, and accept that. But it's when the people become more immoral that they are more likely to use the system of authoritarianism in government, because what it does, it invites the notion and the temptation that I guess everybody has to experience one time or another, and that is greed. Boy, I'd like to have what those other people have. But instead of saying, I'm going to work harder and try to get that, they say, well, the way you get this is you manipulate the government. You just get a benefit from the government. So it's that decision that you can improve oneself by using the government, but the desire to improve oneself and not use government is certainly very positive, and to be more productive and go to work. The other thing that this system that we have, as it leads into a more socialist society, is that of power. There are certain groups of people in all societies who thrive on power. And that sort of just grows and grows. The bigger the government gets, the more people who want in it. So these two characteristics, greed and power, are powerful motivators of these corrupt systems. So yes, I talk about, a philosophy of government that's not corrupt, but believe me, people have to endorse the notion that they can restrain the use of greed in an illegal way to use the government, and to reject the notion that government should be all powerful in running our lives. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be some law and order about restraining violence, but it doesn't mean that the power to redistribute wealth and print the money and run up debts and work that into a philosophic system that we hear preached from the universities, that is what is so much in danger. The answer can be easily found in the concept of liberty, that governments should not be able to do anything that you and I can't do with each other and among the people, and that nobody can use violence. We can't use violence against our neighbors, and the government should not be able to use violence against us just because they want what they think is a utopia that can only be achieved with government force. I don't think it's all that difficult. I think the founders are on the right track. And if we're confused and wonder what to do and say, well, the Constitution didn't work, well, we could start by reading the Constitution and following it and work from there in the direction of more liberty, not less. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.